It is such an honor to host this event with the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. Over the years, we have brought some wonderful programs to life together, and this in many ways feels like the pinnacle. It is not often that we get to sit at the feet of such a magnificent teacher as Susannah Heschel. Okay, I'm going to admit it. I am in awe of Professor Heschel. On my bookshelf is a very well-worn copy of On Being a Jewish Feminist, originally published in 1983, the year after I was ordained, and edited by Professor Heschel. This book changed my life. It was the first anthology that brought together under one cover Jewish feminist voices from all walks of life, prophetic voices all. For me, the greatest gift of this book was the juxtaposition of two articles, one by Cynthia Ozick, entitled Notes Towards Finding the Right Question, and the other by Judith Plaskow, her response to Cynthia Ozick, The Right Question is Theological. As Rachel Adler writes, the right question is theological, exposes halakha, that is Jewish law, as a patriarchal construction. Writing in response to Notes Toward Finding the Right Question by Cynthia Ozick, Judith Plaskow insists that theology, rather than halakha, is primary. Halakha results from theological presumptions, one of which is the fundamental otherness of women. Rather than waste time trying to mend an unmendable halakha, Plaskow argues women should remake theological discourse. Those articles, taken together, brilliantly placed in the same volume, inspired me to want to devote my life to contribute to creating what had, up until that point, been unthinkable: Jewish feminist theology. I have used On Being a Jewish Feminist to teach many classes. It remains a delicious feast of ideas. It is a record of a burgeoning revolution. In many ways, it is the start of that revolution. 35 years later, it still has much to say, and that is a tribute both to the brilliance of the project and its creator, as well as an indicator of how far we still need to go. Professor Heschel, I cannot thank you enough for the work you have done, the seeds you have planted, the impact you have had on my life and the lives of so many Jewish women, for the impact you have had on how 21st century Judaism looks, for the path you have forged. To speak more about Professor Heschel's academic career and the focus of her work, it is my pleasure to call upon Professor Sebastian Wogenstein, Interim Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. We are so grateful to Professor Wogenstein for giving us the opportunity to have Professor Heschel share her wisdom in this space, the sanctuary of the first synagogue built in Connecticut. How appropriate is that? So please welcome Professor Sebastian Wogenstein.
Thank you, Rabbi Berman, and thank you all for joining us this evening. The Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life has sponsored an array of lectures this semester that reached from Kabbalah studies and the study of European Jewish coffeehouse culture, from Holocaust studies to contemporary dance in Tel Aviv. We had a speaker discussing Israeli asylum policies and international human rights law, and we co-sponsored with the University of Hartford's Greenberg Center a talk on the Jewish roots of cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm absolutely delighted that we could partner this evening with the Charter Oak Cultural Center to bring the distinguished scholar Susannah Heschel to Hartford for a talk on human dignity in Judaism. Thank you, Donna. Before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to acknowledge very briefly a few people in the audience. Pam Weathers from the UConn Center for Judaic Studies and James DeMarco from Charter Oak worked very hard on event logistics and publicity. We're grateful to UConn's Humanities Institute, the Department for Literatures, Cultures, and Languages in UConn Hartford for co-sponsoring the event. And Professor Arnie Deshevsky is in the audience, the founding director of UConn Center for Judaic Studies. Donors like Ray and Leah Weinstein and Fred and Eileen Stern help build and sustain our work with the much appreciated generosity. Tonight's lecture is named after Jean and Georgia Mittelman, who were excited to hear about our speaker, but weren't able to make the trip from their Boston area residence down to Hartford, but they're sending their regards. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce with just a few words Professor Heschel. Susannah Heschel is chair of the Jewish Studies program and Ellie Black, professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship focuses on Jewish-Christian relations in Germany during the 19th and 20th centuries, the history of biblioscholarship, and the history of anti-Semitism. Her numerous publications include Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, which won the National Jewish Book Award, and the Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians and the Bible in Nazi Germany. For those among us who read German, she has a forthcoming book in German entitled Jüdischer Islam, Islam und jüdisch-deutsche Selbstbestimmung, translates Jewish Islam, Islam and Jewish German self-definition, self-identity perhaps. So it's ambiguous. And it can be pre-ordered at an online bookseller of your choice for 10 euros. So Professor Heschel has received numerous grants, awards, and fellowships, including grants from the Ford Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Fellowship at the National Humanities Center, a fellowship at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, and most recently a Guggenheim Fellowship. She holds 4 honorary doctorates from universities in the United States, Canada, and Germany. In 2015, she was elected a member of the American Society for the Study of Religion. And since we're in Hartford, I'll mention in conclusion that she also serves on the Board of Trustees at Trinity College. Please join me in welcoming Professor Heschel.
Thank you, Professor Rogenstein and Rabbi Berman, for those very kind words. I appreciate it so much. I want to speak tonight about Jewish views of human dignity, which is a topic that we could say is something that we all experience. We think about our own dignity, we think about the dignity of others, so it has a personal dimension, I imagine, for you as well. I also prepared a few texts that I'm going to mention in my talk. Can everybody hear? Is it too loud or, huh? What? It should be louder? Is that better? Yes? Okay. All right. I'm talking about human dignity in part because it strikes me, if I get too close, it has the feedback. That's the problem. It strikes me that human dignity, first of all, is something that it has some problems to it, in part because of the question of its relationship to human rights. I actually want to show you what some of the problematic areas are, rather than try to resolve it, but just to, let's say, call attention to the problems that we all need to think about together. But it does seem to me that Judaism has some important contributions to make to our understanding of what constitutes human dignity. And I like very much the approach that's taken for that reason. Let me just begin by pointing out that human dignity is an affirmation that exists in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the first item on the sheet that I handed out, where it says, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity, which is a very important concept. We are born with dignity, it's inherent to us, and that's certainly a Jewish belief as well. So whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human foundation. Now notice what's being said here. There's human dignity and they are equal and inalienable rights that belong to all human beings regardless of gender or national origin, anything, yeah? And that is the foundation of what we all want, namely freedom, justice, and peace. So this is very important. This is the building block. And then the first article of the Declaration goes on to say, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Now, here's the problem. What happens with dignity and rights? Are the two really together, supporting one another, or is there sometimes a conflict between dignity and rights? And that's one of the things I will point to in my talk in a moment. And they come together in a spirit of brotherhood, sisterhood, yeah. But that also brings another question, which is, to what extent are women actually present in the thinking about human dignity, even when declarations are made that say we all possess human dignity, inalienably. Okay. Now, I want to begin with the Hebrew word kavod. Hebrew word kavod actually has three meanings. The third one is nowadays tends to be lost, but the first meaning would be honor. The second meaning is dignity, and the third meaning is glory. We have to think for a moment about the difference, what's implied by honor, what's implied by dignity, and what happened to glory, because it's lost in modern Hebrew. So what do we mean by honor, first of all? Honor is usually something that's socially constructed. It's your status in the society. It may be your status as a man, as a woman, as a father, whatever it is. But it's linked to a status somehow in the society. And when the honor is violated, traditionally, what happens? People take revenge. Revenge to restore honor. I'm speaking in general terms, and I'm not considering every single possibility here, but honor is linked to revenge. You restore your honor through revenge. That's why, remember, men used to fight duels to restore honor. But what about dignity? Dignity is something very different from honor. Dignity is not something that is restored if it's violated. It's not restored through revenge. And what's interesting is that even trying to restore dignity through revenge actually makes it worse. It further undermines one's dignity. And I'll come to that again in my talk. But what about glory? What do we mean by kavod as glory? And do you know where it appears in the Bible? Kavod Hashem, the glory of God. And it's interesting when I hear modern Israelis who don't understand that meaning, because Hebrew has unfortunately become so secularized. There's such a negation of the religious when modern Hebrew was being formed. They translate the honor of God. Does God have honor or dignity? It's different. Glory is different. All right. But these are the three ways to think about kavod in classical Hebrew. But now let's think for a moment about what dignity implies. I want to begin with a couple of stories. First of all, there's a story that's told about the great German philosopher Kant. For him, by the way, human dignity was a central principle. Kant was on his deathbed. He was surrounded by his friends, and lying in his bed, he heard that his doctor had just arrived at his home. And he started to get up to go to greet the doctor. And his friend said to him, no, you must rest, conserve your strength. And Kant protested. He said, would you deny me my human dignity? And what's interesting about that is that for Kant to get up, to greet his doctor, in other words, to show respect for his doctor, hospitality for his doctor, to greet his doctor was for Kant a way of affirming his own human dignity. And that strikes me as something that we find in rabbinic Judaism over and over. For example, I'm sure you're all familiar that when someone dies, the body, the corpse, is treated with great respect. It's washed, it's covered, it's never left alone until burial. Someone is always with the body, reciting psalms. A corpse must be treated with dignity. And there are different explanations for this. For example, Yair Loberbaum and Israeli philosophers argued that this is because the human body is created in the image of God. And so therefore, the corpse itself must be treated with respect. That may be. Beyond that, though, I would say the corpse itself doesn't know how it's being treated. The body is dead. But by treating the body with dignity, we are creating dignity for ourselves. We become people of dignity through the way we treat this corpse. And that's what I find over and over again in some rabbinic teachings. So, for example, there's a controversy, and I have this also on the handout sheet. If you look at the first large paragraph, this comes from the Talmud, from Ketubot. It's actually a rather famous dispute, or at least it was famous to me. I always knew about this. That Hillel and Shammai were arguing. Should you say to a bride, she's beautiful? You tell a bride you're beautiful. And then Shammai, who's a little bit sour, I guess, says, well, what if she's not beautiful? And Hillel says, you still say it to her. Now, you know, when I was growing up, I thought, why is this necessary to have this kind of an argument? When I got married, I understood. But I would say, I have to actually tell you about how this passage has been used in the 19th century. But the point of it is this: what does it mean to tell someone, you're beautiful, you're smart, you're wonderful? Somebody once said to me, and this was very important for me, there are two ways to treat your students. You can scold them and warn them, or you can love them. And I still to this day feel guilty about times when I was too scolding of my students and not encouraging enough. Because the truth is, if I say to my students, you're doing so well, and this is such a great question you just asked, and keep up the good work, you know what? They get more involved, they study harder, they do better. People need encouragement. So it's a gift that you give. Now, I just have to tell you, you should forgive me, but when I worked on a book about a 19th century Jewish scholar named Abraham Geiger, I found that in the early 1870s, this passage, this controversy between Hillel and Shammai was being used by some Protestant scholars against Judaism by saying, you see, the rabbis in the Talmud tell you to lie. And I was so appalled by that. I have to just tell you. I know it was a long time ago, but it still bothers me. Anyway, here there is an affirmation. How do you treat another person? What do you say to someone? And in fact, in speaking in this way to this bride, don't you, in fact, not only imbue her, convey dignity to her, but you yourself affirm your dignity in how you treat her with compassion. In Jewish understanding, dignity then has two parts. On the one hand, of course, because we are created in the image of God, and you have the verse here, and I'm sure everybody knows in Genesis 1:26, human beings are created in the image of God, and therefore dignity is inherent. We are images of God, that's clear. But there is a second meaning that comes close to the story about Kant, which is that dignity is something that's enacted, that's performed, that's conveyed. And by so doing, we create our own dignity. But let's think for a moment about what is then the opposite of dignity. The opposite of dignity, I would say, is shame. And here, Rabbinic Judaism has some very important things to say. If you shame a person publicly, it is tantamount to committing murder. That's a very strong statement. And as you know, under Jewish law, if you steal something, if you steal somebody's television, you can't just go and say, I'm sorry, forgive me. You have to first give back the television. But if you speak gossip, bad words about another person and damage a person's reputation, how do you ever give that back? You can't. Just as murder, you cannot bring a person back to life. And so too, evil words about another human being, damaging someone's reputation, is not something that can be restored. It's an unforgivable sin. But let's think again about shame and what constitutes shame. Here I want to mention something. I was in Vienna last month to give a talk. I had a lot of family in Vienna, and I wanted to visit their graves and see where they had lived. And one of my uncle was living there, one of my uncles. He was a Hasidic Rebbe, the Kapitschnitzer Rebbe, and he had a long beard. And the Nazis came, the Anschluss, and they dragged him out to the street, and they wanted to cut off his beard, as they did, you know. And he said, no, you cut off my arm instead. And they were startled by that, and they left him alone. But they made him get down on the street on the cobblestones with a toothbrush to clean the cobblestones, to humiliate him. And I think, well, you know, a Nazi is a Nazi. A Nazi does what a Nazi does. But all around in the street were standing ordinary Viennese Gentiles, and they were laughing, they were mocking. And that's something that I find especially disturbing and troubling. I understand when a Nazi wants to torture somebody, it's horrific. But for somebody to stand around and mock it, then I wonder, how does that person restore his or her human dignity after mocking someone? What do you do to restore that? What can be done? And I just leave you with that question because I don't know myself what you do, but I think that mockery, which is shaming someone, taking pleasure out of the shaming of another person, that to me is the most destructive thing. That's when you destroy your own dignity. And this is important too because I think we're all aware. There's a statement in the Mishnah Kavod that I think is also on this, I hope it's on this passage, on this handout. Let the honor of your fellow human being be as precious to you as your own. From Pirkei Avot. It should be as precious to you as your own because, in fact, your own dignity depends upon the dignity that you convey to another person. That's the point. And in fact, when we think again about the little discussion between Hillel and Shammai and whether you tell the bride that she's beautiful, you see there that you say she's beautiful to avoid shaming her. That's always the bottom line. There is another story that I have also on this handout in the large paragraph on the bottom of the page from Baba Kama, and I'll just summarize it. Rabbi Kiva in this passage scolds a man, or let's say a man comes to Rabbi Kiva, and this man has publicly shamed a woman by taking off her veil. And Rabbi Kiva says, you have to pay her a sum of money in damages. And the man says to him, why should I do that? She herself allowed her veil to fall off her head when she was handling some oil, catching some oil. And she didn't care. And Rabbi Kiva makes the important point here that what matters is what you do to the person. If she lets her veil fall off, that's her business. In other words, if you shame her deliberately, you have done the wicked deed. And you can't say that because her veil came off, she doesn't care or doesn't feel anything. What she does is her business, how she experiences it. And of course, whether she experiences as shame will depend on how people react to her. Will they point the finger and say, look how shameful? Will they mock her, in other words? And Rabbi Kiva says, only the person herself, this woman, has the right to harm her own self for her own private reasons. But that doesn't reduce her own dignity and her right to compensation in a situation that is a non-consensual disgrace. Maybe we should just remember what shame means, because I think that probably all of us have memories from our childhood of a moment, I certainly do, a moment in school, let's say, where you I didn't do my homework and the teacher looked at my notebook and I hadn't filled it out and embarrassed me in front of the whole class. And you remember those things. We all remember those moments of shame and we carry them. And sometimes we even feel it physically, that awful feeling of remembering, even from a long time ago. And it's striking how sharp that feeling is, in contrast to perhaps experiences when we've been treated with great dignity, which we may remember, but it doesn't have the same visceral feeling. It's a wonderful, lovely memory, but shame is a very strong memory. And so there's a very strong effort in Jewish law to prevent shame. And that brings me to another question, which is the question of gender. Now, Judaism insists that dignity is inherent. Treating a corpse, for example, a dead body, it doesn't matter if it's male or female, it has to be treated with dignity. It's also interesting, by the way, that in Judaism, dignity is not only applied to a person, but also to certain moments, for example, the Sabbath, Jewish holidays, or religious objects like a Torah scroll are spoken of in the Talmud as having kavod, as having dignity. But there are also ways in which human dignity in Judaism has some weak spots. Let's think for a moment about the ritual in the Torah, in the Bible, that's also in the Talmud, of what's called sota. What is sota? It's when a husband suspects his wife of having committed adultery and he brings her to the priest and the priest undoes her hair and that puts her through a ritual, etc. It's unpleasant, but I have to say at this particular moment in our cultural history, we can also see that this is a humiliating ritual, a shaming ritual, and what goes on is a kind of sexual harassment at the very least. What's it doing in the Torah? This ritual is justified in a midrash by saying that God pays attention to the kavod of Israel, the dignity of Israel. So we have a sota ritual because God pays attention to the dignity of Israel. And that brings us to the question of who is Israel? In this case, what's being implied by the midrash is that the woman's human dignity is being sacrificed for the sake of the husband, the greater honor of the husband. And here we have dignity versus honor. The husband's honor, and he's thinking, my honor is at stake because maybe my wife had relations with another man. So her dignity is sacrificed for the sake of preserving his honor. In other words, when you feel your honor is violated, you take revenge. And what's the revenge in sota? It's violating the dignity of the woman. That is supposed to restore the honor of the man, according to this midrash. That's a problem. Let me mention another problem here, and that is a classic passage in the Talmud that says that anyone can be called as one of the seven to be called to the Torah to make the blessing for an aliyah. Even women, even a minor, except women are not called for the sake of the honor of the congregation, kavod tzibur. Now, this is an issue that actually came up. Rabbi Berman mentioned the book I edited when I was a student on being a Jewish feminist, and it was discussed even then. Kavod tzibur, the honor of the congregation. Can a woman have an aliyah, be called to the Torah? Can a woman lead the service as a rabbi, as a cantor? What? Is this violating the honor of the congregation? And then there were arguments that people made, and they said, look, nowadays, women are lawyers and doctors and work side by side with men in offices as teachers. It really shouldn't feel like a violation of men's honor if a woman is accorded the same kavod, the same ability to make this blessing. But of course, the real issue is whose honor is at stake? That is, this phrase in the Talmud concerns the honor of men, not the honor of women. Who's speaking here? And once again, we see the problem. Would a man's honor be violated, in this case, by a woman being called to the Torah, and let's say having her dignity affirmed? So here we have the problem. Is the honor of men violated when women are given dignity? Can the honor of women also be spoken about in this context? So that little passage in the Talmud was one that became really a key passage in a lot of the feminist debates. But I want to point to what I think is a wonderful response to it from a very Orthodox rabbi, the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel, Rav Ovadia Yosef, who passed away just a few years ago, was a deeply learned scholar of Jewish law. And here's the response that he gave, the tshuva that was printed. He was approached by a woman. She was married and she was pregnant. And she came to him because earlier in her life she had not been a religious Jew, and then at that time she had become pregnant as a single woman and had an abortion. Later, she became very religious, married to someone in a yeshiva, and now she's expecting their first child. Her concern was this: if the child is a boy, the parents will want to arrange a pidyon haben, a redemption of the firstborn son. And that is a ceremony that involves saying certain blessings that the father would say over a child who was the first, if it's a boy, the first child to emerge from her womb. But since she had an abortion, she didn't know what to do. She didn't want to tell her husband that she had had an abortion, but she also didn't want to cause him to make a bracha levatala, a blessing that has no relevance in this pidyon haben. And Ovadia Yosef, who was not in the least, I would say, not in the least feminist at all, who was the opposite, came up with the following response. He said that the pidyon haben should take place, absolutely, that the woman should not tell her husband about the prior abortion, didn't need to know that. And he said the pidyon haben should take place with all of the required blessings. They should be said in order to preserve the woman from any kind of public shaming. Because he argued, and this was his principle, great is human dignity because it overrides even a precept of the Torah. To preserve someone from shame takes precedence over, and he said, the negative precepts of the Torah. That is, prohibition against saying a bracha levatala or against having an abortion. So in some sense, the emphasis that he places on shame and the absolute importance of avoiding shaming someone, that precedence of that becomes a small opening, a small door for women to say, or for anyone to say, this is not acceptable if it shames me. But there are other problems, and that is, for example, does human dignity coincide or support human rights, the rights of the individual? Does human dignity even demand equality of people? You know, there are elements in Jewish law that say, for instance, when you're buried, you have to be buried in a simple pine coffin. No matter how wealthy you are, you don't display it. And you don't display wealth when you get married. A bride is not allowed to wear jewelry to show that she's wealthy, to avoid, specifically, to avoid shaming a bride who doesn't have money. So one can lie, one can keep quiet about an abortion, all kinds of things, never to shame someone. But what happens when we have human dignity in collision with human rights? There are two Israeli scholars, Doron Sholziner and Guy Carmi, who have written about the constitutions that were written after World War II in many, many countries that emerged from colonialism, for example, or Germany that emerged from war. And you know, in Germany, the Constitution from 1948 begins by speaking of the inviolable dignity of the human being, absolute dignity of human beings, and that has been interpreted by the German Supreme Court as saying you can never, ever torture anyone, never. Jewish law, it's also not never, but it's a problem. But what they discovered in their study was that although the national constitutions proclaim human dignity, in the various Supreme Court decisions, sometimes human dignity is invoked to protect the individual and sometimes against the individual. So for instance, in Uganda, female genital mutilation was outlawed on the grounds of human dignity. In India, human dignity was invoked by the Supreme Court to protect the dignity of women and women's rights to inheritance. On the other hand, dignity has also been invoked to protect the nation, the religion, the community. I'll give you an example from the Israeli Supreme Court. In 1967, there was a case of someone who had gotten into an altercation with a neighbor, and the neighbor wore side locks, payas. And the man who was angry cut him off. Now, of course, they'll grow back, but the man whose payas had been cut off sued his neighbor. And the ruling that was made by the court was that cutting these off was not just an attack on an individual that would be a misdemeanor, but it was an attack on Jewish national honor. And here we see kavod interpreted as honor. There was another Supreme Court case in Israel more recently regarding transportation on the Sabbath. Are you allowed to drive in a religious neighborhood on a holiday or on the Sabbath that prohibits driving? One of the justices, Aaron Barak, who is a secular Jew, said that human dignity upholds the autonomy granted by freedom of movement. You have the dignity, the right to drive yourself wherever you go, whether or not it's a Sabbath or a holiday. But a religious justice in that case, Tzvital, said that freedom of movement on the Sabbath was of lesser importance than preserving respect for the significance of the Sabbath in Jewish tradition. And so again, we see human dignity being invoked on the one hand for the right of the individual to drive, and on the other hand to protect the Sabbath. And now I'll just mention, and I'm coming to my close now, an example of how this has also come up just recently in the United States. You may know the case before the Supreme Court about a baker in Colorado who was asked by a gay couple to make a wedding cake for their wedding. And he refused on the grounds that he's a Christian and doesn't believe in gay marriage, and he refused to bake the cake. When the case was argued at the Supreme Court, what's interesting about it is that the US Solicitor General, who argued on behalf of the baker, told the justices that the dignity of the baker is at stake here, forcing the baker to comply with a public accommodations law that protects the rights of gay people to equality, that forcing him to comply with that denies him his dignity as a Christian. And then the lawyer for the gay couple claimed that their human dignity was being denied by the refusal of the baker to bake the cake for them. So if dignity is on both sides of this issue, what do? How do we adjudicate conflicting claims to dignity? We might finally ask ourselves if we're talking about dignity or if we're talking about honor, and whether the two are in conflict. We might ask if the state, for example, if a state or a religion or a nation, as an abstract concept, possesses dignity. A dignity that can be, in fact, hurt, violated, destroyed in some way, or whether the dignity of the nation or the religion might be like that of a corpse. It's something that you might convey, you might show respect, but itself can't be injured in that sense. Finally, we have to ask ourselves, how we want to translate the term kavod as honor, as dignity, or as God's glory. And you have to think about it for a moment. If the Bible says kavod Hashem, the kavod of God, the glory of God, would we translate it as the dignity of God, the honor of God? Does God have honor? No. Dignity? No. There is something intrinsically human about it, even though, as we know, human dignity is derived from being created in God's own image. So the question then remains for us, and the problem that we have theologically and legally, who defines dignity? How do we adjudicate it? What do we do when dignity comes into conflict with human rights, or the rights of the individual? And yet finally, we have to conclude that dignity has a very compelling power. Dignity is something that we need to have affirmed for us, and that we need to convey in order to experience it in ourselves. Perhaps I'll mention one last story in conclusion. I had a student at Dartmouth who graduated with a major in religion, graduated with honors, and went out into the world. And this student happens to be African American, tall and dark-skinned, and he's also a great pianist and organist. And every now and then he would drive up to Vermont to play the organ at a church. And one evening when he was driving back, he stopped at a gas station. Now, as it happens, that same summer that he stopped at that gas station, I had been invited to a reception at the White House. President Obama was in the White House then. And he invited civil rights leaders and members of their families to come to a beautiful reception. And I, of course, could have taken my husband or my children, but I took my student because I knew how much it would mean to him. So he came with me, and he was, of course, thrilled and excited, and it was great because he also recognized people that I didn't know, I didn't recognize, and it was wonderful. And it was a great moment, and he got to shake hands with President Obama, and it meant so much to him. And then about 2 weeks later, there he was at this gas station late at night, filling up his car with gas, about to drive back to Boston. And all of a sudden, 3 young white men pulled up in a truck, a pickup truck, and stopped and started screaming and threatening him. And he was scared, and he immediately stopped the gasoline, jumped in his car, and drove away. And I was very struck by that. I was struck by the contrast. The 2 weeks earlier, there he was, welcomed at the White House, shaking the hands of the president, standing around and talking to some of the most distinguished civil rights leaders of our day. And 2 weeks later, he could be treated this way with such contempt. So I suppose for us, the overriding issue is, while we recognize dignity as something that is not just inviolable, but really necessary for our well-being, and we recognize that dignity is something that we need to convey to one another, even when it means overriding certain principles of law, of religion. How do we prevent racism, sexism, the kinds of destructive forces that seek so quickly and so easily to demolish our sense of dignity? I do think that there's something remarkable about human beings, that we're able to find dignity within ourselves, even when we are in a situation of public humiliation, of people demeaning us. I know that my uncle in Vienna didn't feel demeaned. He felt his dignity, and he was, in fact, the one person with dignity in that scene. Again, I don't know how those people who were mocking ever restored their human dignity. But finally, I would say that this question of dignity is something for us in terms of Judaism to keep at the forefront of our minds. It may be something that's inherent, that we're born with, but above all, dignity is that which we create in ourselves by conveying it to one another. Thank you. Please. Yes. I'd be happy to take questions and comments.
Experience that I wanted to share, and that is that my father was a Kohen. So I guess I'm a Bat Kohen. And on the high holiday, when the Kohanim go and get their feet washed symbolically, I went. And one of the guys basically said, "Now I've seen everything."
Did everybody hear the comment? Oh, so let me repeat. I don't know your name. Miriam. Miriam says her father was a Kohen, a priest. You know, Jews are divided: priests, Levites, and Israel. And on the high holidays, when the priest goes up, before blessing the congregation, the priest goes to have his feet washed. And so Miriam went and said, she is, of course, a daughter of a Kohen, a Bat Kohen. And she went also to have her feet washed. And some man said to her, "Now I've seen everything." He's trying to make a demeaning comment. That's too bad, especially at that moment. Yeah, I think I would say that when you say something demeaning to another person, it's going to be a long time before you're going to be ready to pray again. Yeah. Yes?
When you talked about Kavod at Tzibor,
Kavod at Tzibor, yes, the honor of the congregation.
is that the justification used to harass the women of the law? I'm not even a kid. I've never understood how you could treat people who are trying to pray by spitting on them and screaming and yelling, and it's not just the men, it's young women as well. So is that their justification for doing the exact opposite, for preserving somebody else's dignity? Because they're protecting the men from being offended that they're using for prayer.
So first of all, you know, the question had to do with what happens at the Kotel, at the Western Wall. And of course, only recently has there been a separation. That is, for 2,000 years, there was no mechitza, no separation between men and women, and somebody had the idea to do it. And now when women go to pray, it's actually become a very ugly scene. If you show up and women, they do all kinds of things and cover you up, etc. But women who were coming also with the Torah and who want to pray as a community were being harassed in horrible ways, in dangerous ways, with chairs thrown at them and spat at it and so forth. What justifies it is nothing that justifies that, nothing at all. Yeah. Legally speaking, in Jewish law, no, nothing justifies it. But people have gotten crazy, and the question is, what's happened? There is a kind of insanity that I feel as though the water's polluted with something that's making us crazy. And it's worldwide, and it's, of course, as you know, not just Jews. And we have evangelical Christians now telling us that Trump is their man. What does that mean? Look at his behavior. I think it's true in the Muslim community, but it's true in the Jewish world. There is no legal justification for that. And I would say also that when I was a student at Trinity, I was saying Kaddish for my father, and there were times when I was thrown out of synagogues. Even when they met in a classroom during the week. It's not a makom kavua, it's not a set place for prayer. There's no reason to have a separation. It's wrong, but they're getting away with it. And what is it coming from? It's not coming from Jewish law, it's coming from something else. And they're not willing to admit it, and there are no rabbinic authorities who are speaking out from their community. Just tell them to stop it and to behave like mentioned. Yeah, I agree with you.
I may have misunderstood you, but I thought you said that the relation of dignity and honor to God there wasn't a connection there? And I question that.
You know, in a way, I agree with you. I would say this. If honor is something that's about social status, then I would find it hard theologically to understand God as possessing honor or God to be dishonored. But I do think that what is implied if we say that the dignity of God is offended or Actually, there is a passage that says that God created human beings for the sake of his dignity. Yeah. There is a way in which our behavior is a reflection or reflects upon God, the way we behave. There's an old rabbinic idea called tzorach gavoha, which is an idiom that means divine need, that God needs us. There's a midrash that says, I am God and you are my witnesses, and if you are not my witnesses, then I am not God. So in that sense, I would say yes. I think in terms of some of the other issues that I've talked about, that is of I acquire dignity by conveying it to others, that's where I would have a problem of thinking in those terms about God. But otherwise, yeah, I agree. Did I answer you in what you meant? Was that?
I think this is something that each one of us maybe have to answer for ourselves and not.
Okay. All right.
I know that I personally have respect and honor for God. That's why we behave the way we do with the kind of dignity that you're talking about.
So we would bring shame upon God by behaving badly.
If one wants to believe there's God.
But I don't think God is, in fact, ontologically shamed.
No, not. But in our respect for God, or the God of Judaism, that's what defines how we behave to other people.
Yes. Yes. So when you say to shame a person publicly is like murdering because their face turns red, yeah? It's metaphorical. They're not really dead, metaphorical. And it becomes then a hortatory expression. It's a way of giving ourselves a moral lesson. Don't do that. In that sense, I could see it. I didn't hear you?
The idea of Kavod or Kavod Shabbat, are those kinds of dignity in Judaism similar to or different from the idea of Kavod Tzibur? Is there something about an object or a temporal zone that is different? And because my understanding is that in certain forms of contemporary German philosophy, there are other ways of thinking about dignity in relation to.
I can't quite hear you. Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah. The idea
Maybe stand up.
So
Yeah.
the idea of the dignity of the Torah, the dignity of Shabbat,
Mhm.
are those kinds of dignities that are similar to the idea of Kavod HaTzibur, or is there something different about using the idea of dignity to refer to an object or to time, space and time? Is that a completely different way of thinking about dignity, or is that an extension of the kinds of dignity that you've been problematizing for us?
So could you say, for example, that the dignity that you show to the collective, whether it's Shabbat or a Torah, is similar to the dignity that you speak of when you speak of the dignity of the corpse? That is, the subjectivity may not be there, but it becomes an idea that is linked to you and becomes an impetus for your own performance. So you convey dignity to the Torah through your actions, through your behavior. And in so doing, you yourself acquire dignity, how you treat. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking of?
Yeah, so it seems like really in every respect, dignity is relational, right? It's about relationships and it's about the ways in which the treatment of another or the treatment of an object or the treatment of a particular time will have implications for our own dignity, except for this one other kind of dignity, the idea of the dignity of God, the glory of God. That's sort of a separate thing altogether, and everything else would seem to cluster together as different understandings of dignity that really have to do about relationality. Is that sort of a fair accounting?
Yes, but I think when I deal with another person, that person has subjectivity and a response. And when I deal with an object like a Torah scroll, the Torah scroll itself doesn't have the subjectivity that a human being does.
But in each case, it's about the relation, and in one case, there's something reciprocal happening, and in the other, it's really fundamentally about the damage one can do to oneself by not honoring something that has been designated as being with a kind of sanctity.
You know, I think that there is a relationship one has with other people and with objects that exists within ourselves. So I have an imaginative, let's say, relationship even with another person that is in addition to your own subjectivity. I understand your subjectivity. I relate to you in some way. And similarly with an object becomes holy to me. It possesses memories and importance, significance that affects my life. So I do have a relationship with it, even an inanimate object. But with a person, there is the response. I think what I want to emphasize here, and let me just say that there is also a theological tradition, especially in Catholicism, that talks about the sacredness of the person. And I'm thinking about Hans Joas, for example, as the central issue, the sacredness. And what's missing for me is the relationship. When Thomas Aquinas talks about being created in the image of God, for him there is a static entity within the human being that reflects God. That's the image. But yes, I want it to be more dynamic. And I want to also perhaps say that there needs to be a sacramental element here. That is, what you call relationship is also about sacramentality, which means that God didn't simply create us in an image, as an image, but that God is present. And in the presence of God, presence in the moment, presence in the relationship, that makes the relationship far more significant. So in that sense, I find a sacramental approach theologically more compelling than the sacredness approach. But I'm not going in the direction of Levinas, if that's what you have in mind.
I wanted to thank you and to say that I've been so impressed with your ability to deconstruct and analyze and explain so many things I hadn't really thought about before. But one of the things that you mentioned, and I think is really a dilemma, is this idea that dignity and honor are in some ways mutually exclusive, that they can't exist simultaneously in the same place and time, so that one could be almost used, for lack of a better way of expressing this, as an excuse, so we can do things to others that would in one sense show a lack of dignity for ourselves by torturing, injuring, hurting others, but we're allowed that if we're doing it in the name of honor, and that there's this sort of transcendent concept. So, these are the borders around my property, and if you trespass these borders that I have decided are my borders, whether they are contrived or not, then I have within me the right to harm you, which would be an act lacking dignity to harm another human being. But I have the right to do that because my honor is at stake. And that does pose a true human dilemma, for which there's no solution. There's no end. There's always going to be a sense of one's honor being injured. Concerning.
Is there always going to be a sense of one's honor being injured? I'm not quite as pessimistic as that. I think, we have stopped fighting duels, for instance, or we are able to acknowledge something that's painful in ourselves and try to work out something that will take us in a different, not away from revenge, in other words. I think also perhaps recognizing that there are ways to rise above a situation, even when you're very angry. And that's the invocation of dignity as opposed to vengeance. I think that dignity can sometimes function to restore, be very restorative. But it takes something. It takes an awareness, and it's, I think, frightening for a lot of people.
Actually, continuing on that topic, it occurs to me that dignity is something you can give to someone and still have yourself.
Dignity, I didn't hear you, what was that?
You give it to someone and still have it. You don't pass it on to them, you share it.
You share it, yes.
And it occurs to me, can you think of ways that can be helpful sort of in societies to get above these honor killings we were talking about, sort of if dignity can be shared, how can that help us to sort of help other people become more whole as well?
You know, let me just say that what was so important to me growing up was that my father was involved in the civil rights movement. And I had the opportunity to meet Martin Luther King and many other civil rights leaders over the years. And in fact, I have to just tell you that every time I meet somebody from the civil rights movement, they hug me, they embrace me, they love me. They love me because they love my father and the fact that look what he did for us. That's what they say. And I think that's really quite extraordinary, that kind of gratitude. But I think what I learned from that movement was, first of all, that in fact, dignity can rise above even anger and cruelty and hatred. Because that's what that movement was about. It was about dignity. And what I learned from that also was what religion can do, and specifically what the prophets can do. And I have to say, I wrote a book about Protestant theologians in Nazi Germany who supported Hitler. They're running around saying that the Old Testament is a Jewish book that has no place in the Christian Bible. Yeah? Because we're all Nazis now. They said Jesus wasn't a Jew, Jesus was an Aryan. Somebody wrote a novel that said Jesus was born in Schleswig-Holstein. This kind of craziness. They wanted to eliminate Hebrew words, no more hallelujah in the hymnal. They didn't want people to say amen, things like this. And then comes the civil rights movement. And what did Dr. King do? He made the Exodus, Moses, the prophets, the central motif of the civil rights movement. You have to think about it for a minute. That was just a few minutes after what the Nazis did. Think about it historically. When did that ever happen? He could have talked about Jesus, but if you look at all of his major speeches, he doesn't talk about Jesus in the Gospels. He was making an open arm, open tent. That didn't happen in Germany. I just did a study of German biblical scholarship on the prophets. And you know what they said about the prophets, about Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah? In the 1890s, into World War I, they said the prophets were ecstatics. They were writhing on the ground, losing consciousness. They didn't even know what they were saying. They demeaned the prophets. Then there was no possibility of being inspired by the prophets the way we had in the civil rights movement. Okay, so what do I have from this? I tell you, and don't mind if I also just mentioned that in December 1915, Ernst Troeltsch gave a lecture in Berlin. What did he say? He said the prophets were rural country bumpkins. They didn't know anything, and they come into the urban cities, the centers where there's a king and a magnificence and so on, and they said that you shouldn't make war anymore. How stupid, Troeltsch says. How naive. What is this? What kind of a way is that to talk about Amos, Isaiah? This is unbelievable. So they had no more resource where they could say, in the name of justice, in the name of peace, we're against war, we're against racism, we're against anti-Semitism. It would be a way to unite. But they didn't have it because these scholars had destroyed the prophets. So in America, I think what was extraordinary about the civil rights movement for me is the power of the prophets and the power of the Bible to soften hardened hearts and to say, yes, we're going to rise above. We're going to rise above these social regulations, this Jim Crow, and speak about dignity. And so I think, indeed, there is a possibility. I have to say, I lived through it. There is a way in which the Bible can lead us up to a level of dignity. It isn't a guarantee in any way, but it is a possibility. Thank you.
I actually have two questions. One is, you advocated for the dignity of the gay and lesbian community. So could you say something about the orange?
Yes. Oh. There's a new wrinkle in this story, by the way. Okay, so many years ago, when I published that book on Jewish feminism, I had gone to Oberlin College to give a talk, and I heard that I saw this Haggadah that had been made by some students there, and it was a lesbian Haggadah, and they had a wonderful story in it. They put a crust. They said it was a metaphor. Being a lesbian is like having a crust of bread on the Seder plate, and I thought, it's a good idea to affirm solidarity with gay and lesbian Jews, but crust of bread is transgressive. It makes it no longer Passover, and I don't think being gay and lesbian is transgressive. So instead I thought I'd put an orange. So I put an orange on the Seder plate. If you peel an orange, you never see that there's one segment missing. It's always all the segments are there in the orange. Everyone sticks together. And everybody took a piece of the orange and they spit out the seeds as if spitting out the seeds of homophobia. And over the years, people would add gay and lesbian Jews, Jews who are marginalized in the community, widows, orphans, sometimes people who are children adopted from other countries and who don't, quote unquote, look Jewish, whatever that means. Everybody looks Jewish. And so on. So it became an affirmation of Jewish solidarity. But specifically, I started it as solidarity with gay and lesbian Jews. So over the years, what happened? People started saying to me, I would mention this sometimes when I would give a speech, people started saying to me, I heard you were giving a speech in the Holy Land, Miami Beach. And at the end, a man stood up and denounced you and said, women belong on the bima like an orange on the Seder plate, ha ha ha. And so they would say to me, I'm gonna put an orange on the Seder plate. And I said, first of all, you take my idea from a woman and you give it to a man said it. And then women are on the bima. Women by now are ordained rabbis. So what's the problem that what's the great political thing? You're putting an orange on the Seder plate. It's like saying I'm putting an orange on the Seder plate because the sun rises in the, okay. And then, of course, they erased the whole issue of the homophobia, which was my point in the first place. Now, let me tell you what happened. So this has been circulating over and over again, but just recently, Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times wrote an op-ed right after Passover, and he mentions that women are now ministers and rabbis, and it's great, and women are, and so on. Women are contributing something to religion. All right. Very nice, thank you, okay. But he said, and he mentioned, and among other things, there's an orange on the Seder plate for women on the bima, something to that effect. So I wrote a letter to the New York Times, fine. And then I got an email back right away from Nicholas Kristof's assistant, who said to me, well, but by now, that story about the orange has been embraced by so many people as a symbol for women on the bima. So that's why we put it in that way. Now, who is this woman who wrote to me? Zoe Greenberg. She's the daughter of Julie Greenberg, Rabbi Julie Greenberg, herself a lesbian rabbi in Philadelphia, who was my old friend when I was in graduate school, and who really struggled in those days with ordination, women's rights, and so on. But I was amazed because this is what happened. So the story is now very popular, which is fine. The homophobia is removed. It's become a kind of bland affirmation of something that already exists rather than something that should challenge us, that we need to do. But here's this young woman who's the daughter of one of the pioneer women struggling in the rabbinate to win acceptance as a lesbian. And she herself, the daughter, accepts the depoliticization of this story. And that I found really rather remarkable. Why depoliticize? And why would she, of all people? You see what I mean? So when we do something at the Seder, we're doing it with a purpose. Every passage in the Haggadah is a kind of affirmation that's telling us this is what you should do. This is what you should think. Every Jew should feel as if he or she went forth personally from Egypt, it says in the Haggadah. So there are constant affirmations, things that we're told, this is what you should do. And I think the orange, when it's depoliticized, runs against the grain of what Passover Seder is all about. We say halach ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction, how we start our Seder. Why do we do that? Why do we hold up the matzah and say halach ma'anya? What are we saying? We're saying this is not the body of you-know-who, right? Yeah. The Haggadah was written to counter the claims of the Eucharist. That's why we hold it up the way he held it up. He said, this is my body. We hold it up and say, no, this is the bread of affliction. Every line in the Passover Haggadah is telling us something. It's we're polemicizing. Yeah? So too, hopefully, the orange will recover its political affirmation.
You need to write a kids book about the orange.
Oh, that's an idea.
New generation.
Yeah, that's an idea. Good idea. Yeah. Anybody else? I think you wanted to say. Yeah.
Maybe I should have four. If part of our human dignity is
Louder, louder.
if part of our human dignity is derived from the fact that we're created in God's image, when we don't treat each other with dignity, is it an affront to God? Can you look at it that way?
Is it an affront to God? I would say, does God have subjectivity? Or is God the unmoved mover of Aristotle? Does it ever say in the Bible that God is omniscient, omnipotent, unmoved? I don't think so. So does God have subjectivity? Is God affected by human beings? Doesn't God get upset when we do bad things to each other? When you injure another person? When people are cruel to each other? Look how the prophets rage against what? Maltreatment of widows and orphans, cheating in the marketplace. They scream about it. Why do they scream about it? Obviously, God cares deeply and is affected and gets angry. And also, says, okay, gets over the anger, forgives. So I think the answer would be, look, when Maimonides started writing, it was as if he was creating a new religion. And the Jews burned Maimonides' books because they didn't like, for a variety of different reasons, with the Maimonidean controversy. But to say that God is impassive, doesn't feel anything, is really not Jewish. And I think it's, yeah, okay. So indeed, I would say yes.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.